Summer of 85 is a new French-Belgian film written and directed by François Ozon. Have you seen any of his films before? I've heard of plenty of films he's done. I don't think I've ever really seen an Ozon film. I don't think so.
Oh, really? Yeah, I actually like the director a good bit. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a lot of his films either, but I have seen Swimming Pool, which I like a good bit.
Heard great things about that movie.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that film. It would be a good double feature with this one, I think.
I did see one of his films, Young and Beautiful.
Okay, yeah. Is that one of his earlier one, or is that from the late...
A little later. That's from like 2012, 2013, something like that.
Was it? Oh, okay. Maybe I'm thinking of something else then. I did see his most recent film, By the Grace of God, which... good film, but man, that was a tough watch. And this one is definitely... comparatively a lot more lighthearted, I will say.
Yeah, well, it has a Cure song, so it's like any movie with a Cure song, I mean, with In Between Days in particular.
Yeah. But, I mean, in our Luca review, we were talking about a film that I feel like is going to get hurt by people making constant Call Me By Your Name references. And I feel like this is a film that might be hurt more by that. But would you agree or disagree by that?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of takes, where people are saying this is France's answer to Call Me By Your Name. I think one review said it was an insubstantial answer to Call Me By Your Name. And then another, people kind of making the obvious comparison. For me, France's answer to Call Me By Your Name was Portrait of a Lady on Fire, first of all.
There you go.
Second of all, yes, I think, and we'll explain what this movie is about, but I do want to start with this. There is a sort of similar to how, like, let's take Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Ammonite, World to Come, these films that tackle the lesbian experience through a very familiar set of rules to the point where SNL was able to parody that sort of like lesbian period drama, where it really feels like every year a studio is trying to put out a lesbian period drama to win awards, where they cast straight actors to sort of play these characters and do all of that, right?
Yeah, and, no electricity.
There were... exactly.
Yeah.
The jokes are like, like there's only 10 words of dialogue, like stuff like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Whereas Portrait, I think, is probably the pinnacle of those films, at least in my opinion. We've seen, like Ammonite, I think, was just such a wash. I think Summer of 85...
Was that deliberate because it's by the ocean side, or just in general was a wash?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Sure.
You could take that when you will.
Sure.
There. I think in the other side of that, the other side of the spectrum, where you have cinematic films about gay men, I think that there is a similar sort of thing you could parody, where you have two young men. Sometimes there's usually like an age difference. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes smaller, who spend a summer together in a European countryside, sort of, a little bit more modern, and one of them is probably bi. Like, that tends to be sort of the thing that happens in a lot of these films. And I don't think that that's to take anything away from Call Me By Your Name or Summer of 85 or, this sort of like familiar structure we see. And I'm just going to say, I think it's a little unfair to compare this to Call Me By Your Name. It's a little bit, it's like what we were saying earlier with Luca. It's like comparing two movies just because they tackle the same subject. It's like the comparisons are not that strong, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see why, not only in terms of like the story, but like visually they have a kind of similar look and feel to them. But especially in terms of like how they use nostalgia and to point even kind of weaponize it. But I mean, I feel like comparing either film to Call Me By Your Name sort of just cheapens them as opposed to makes it a valid comparison. But I can understand with both films why they are getting those comparisons, I guess.
Yeah, it's understandable. I mean, I can't deny that. So let's set this thing up. As we sort of alluded to, and yes, the title sort of gives it away. This takes place in the summer of 85, but in France. And I believe Normandy is where it takes place. And it premiered at Cannes last year. The story is that we follow this young man named Alexis, played by Félix Lefebvre. I don't know how to put it. My French, as usual, as the listeners know, is terrible, disgusting.
Yeah. Real quick, it was supposed to premiere at Cannes, I think, because they didn't have it last year.
Yeah, thank you. I misspoke. It was set to premiere at Cannes last year. But of course, the pandemic and all of that. And then, I think it played eventually at TIFF that year. But yeah, so this young man, Alexis, he's like 16 years old, and he's sort of spending a quiet summer in the French countryside. And one day his boat capsizes, and he is rescued by this dashing, handsome gentleman named David Gorman, played by Benjamin Voisin. And the two of them strike up a friendship. That friendship eventually becomes something a little bit more. And a lot of this movie is set over narration because Alexei is recounting this. He's a writer, and he's recounting this story in the aftermath of, as the film gives away at the very, very, very beginning, that David has mysteriously died. And Alexei has done something that's related to the death that could get him in a lot of trouble. And sort of the movie is sort of capturing this sort of balance between the death and sexuality, identity, and coping with grief, which is probably one of the strongest things about this movie. And a lot of this film is, I'd say the first half of it is like this very sort of predictable whirlwind summer romance, but then the second half of the film becomes something a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit more, it went into some directions I wasn't expecting. And I think that's where the film really finds its footing, its sea legs, if you will. And I came out of this film liking it, not loving it. But I think what I like about it is it has a very French New Wave sort of sensibility. It's sort of trying to capture probably more the post-French New Wave. I'd say probably closer to not the time period, but more like the 70s of French independent cinema, which we didn't mention when we were talking about the Sparks Brothers, but lovely parody of the French New Wave in that film, I want to point out. But no, this movie is, like you're saying, it's capturing a nostalgia of that time. It's using a lot of the film techniques of that time as well. There's not a lot of stuff here that's very modern, except for how avant-garde it is about a homosexual relationship between two men in Europe, which is something that I just don't think would have come out in this way back then. But we're sort of seeing what if we had got a movie like this in the 1980s or earlier. And so that's something that I appreciate about it. I don't love it because I think that it's still a little bit too derivative. I think that I think there are parts of it that are just a little bit shaggy in the way where they really portray this romance and this misunderstanding in sort of a rushed fashion. I think stuff happens in this that does feel a little rushed. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe that's sort of speaking to how life is. And so I sort of understand that to a point. But what did you think, Will? I think it seems like critics like this, but some people really hate it. I think Odie Henderson gave it a 1-star review on RogerEbert.com, and some people are really looking at this and saying it's just sort of it's like, it feels like parody to them of a movie that could be much better.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for them per se, but I'll be honest, I actually was quite taken by this film. I can understand why, as you were mentioning, it is somewhat derivative of other films, LGBT films in this vein. And I'm not saying that it does anything wholly original with the premise or the concept, but I think what really stands out to me is how much this film, sort of similar to Luca, is able to be so vibrant and full of life in its presentation. I mean, for one, it looks gorgeous. It's shot on 16mm film, and I think that's for the better. I think just how crisp it looks, like the way it just like it feels like you're in the sun with these characters throughout, right. Is great. I love the environment of the film. Like, it feels like you're just constantly kind of like immersed in the like sea waves coming through and stuff like that. And I did find the relationship at its core to be very rich and lush in its presentation. I actually, the thing you're talking about where you felt it was rushed, I feel like that was appropriate because, like, as the movie mentions, so it was only 6 weeks. Like, the movie is supposed to right. Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's like a summer long, but it's only like a month and a half maybe that these two characters grew so passionate, so close to one another. And I think the movie is really good about capturing that feeling of when you're like with somebody and it just like the world like sort of stops and then you just like you're with that person, and like it just feels like there's like this bountiless sort of like love and like exuberance to the world. And I think it captures that feeling really well in a very evocative way that, like I said, not terribly new or something that hasn't been done in several other films in its fame, but I think for what it's trying to do, it does that very well. Yeah,
it does a good job of like making you forget that, you know, the film opens with us knowing that one of these characters is dead. You know, it doesn't tell us how, it doesn't tell us why, but I think that because it's such an escapist romance, you forget. And then I think where this film really, like I said before, really just transforms into something a little bit deeper, a little bit more interesting for me at least, is when it just kind of goes down the aftermath of all of this. And there's, I think, a lovely relationship between Alexei and a character, I won't say who it is, that kind of blossoms in the second half of this movie that I found really touching. And there were some things that I was feeling a little cold from, particularly the relationship with his parents. And I think that Alexei's parents, I think there was something to be said there about how it felt. Maybe it is appropriate there too, for it to be understated in a way and for it to be a lot about what's unsaid. But I appreciated at least that this movie, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's a pretty brisk movie. And I think that's a good point you bring up about how it does feel a little bit purposeful in the way that it's making this summer romance feel all the more fleeting and abrupt, especially. I forgot to mention too, this is partly based on a novel from 1982 called Dance on My Grave by Aidan Chambers. And I'll just mention one of my favorite musical moments of 2021 will probably be this film's use of Sailing, the Rod Stewart song, which is just so lovely. It really is like a spellbinding scene that gets evoked there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think because the film is also still fresh for me, I'm probably still kind of caught in the glow of it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I like I said, I think what it's trying to do, it does very well. As for the parents, I don't know. I was feeling that way until like the last like 20 or 30 minutes when I think that relationship really sort of crystallized for me. And I think the performances there are good about like establishing a sort of like emotional distance, but like a desire to like want to be in their kid's life in a way that I think it didn't really click for me earlier in the film. But when it got to that point, I thought it was pretty touching and well done. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that this film is going to do anything that hasn't been done in several other films, either better or worse. But at the end of the day, I think it succeeds in what it's trying to do, and it does that well.
Yeah, I think the thing I appreciate about it too is that it's not afraid to really showcase the positivity of this relationship. It's not doing too much like tragic melodrama and melancholy with these characters. It really is like showing them at their best. And there's a lot of beauty to it. I worry that, some people will watch it and be a little bit like, meh. I expect that'll happen for some people, but I am kind of trying to figure out, because I'm caught in the glow as well. I just watched this like you did, I don't know how people are going to react. I don't know like which type of people will watch this and get out of it what I think the film wants them to get out of it.
Yeah, but I think one thing I do really appreciate about the romance is that it is very clear that it's coming from his written perspective, which is obviously going to be very nostalgic for reasons that become clear early on. But at the same time, it does like you understand like the earnest, real emotion of the scene, but recognizing that it is like meant to be a little bit skewed, like a little bit from his perspective in a way that's doesn't always seem fully honest. It like seems a little heightened at times, but not in a way that makes it feel false or insincere. I think that's a pretty good balance that the film strives.
I agree with that. And I think this film's ending, it's not as good as Call Me By Your Name. I know we shouldn't be making all those like easy comparisons or whatever, but this film's ending, that's what pushed it for me. I was a little bit undecided. I was a little bit like, do I really like this movie as much as I do? How are they going to like really stick the landing here? And just like the last few minutes of this movie where I really like, that is character growth. That is a character arc, simple and through. And the thing I didn't love about the movie is there's sort of stuff that they kind of weave in, with like a teacher and everything that has to do with like Alexei, like writing the novel and like processing his grief through writing, things like that. I think is interesting, but I felt a little half baked to me.
Yeah.
How did you feel?
It kind of felt like those were the moments that interest the filmmaker the least. Just like they might have been almost a little perfunctory in terms of their presentation. I don't think they're ever bad, but just
or maybe obligatory. Like maybe there were the things that were a little bit like, because he's done it in other films as far as I understand, sure. Right? And almost like kind of inserting this because he feels like he should almost.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I just found it to be like it is purposeful. Like I don't think it is without purpose, like in terms of like what it's trying to do. But I just felt like those moments weren't as interesting to Ozon at this point. So he just like, all right, let's get these out of the way, and then we'll get back to the romance.
Yeah. I think the pacing though still kind of works. Like I didn't feel like when they were kind of cutting back and forth between the flash forward and the flashbacks, I thought that all kind of worked out pretty well. And yeah, I don't have too many complaints besides that. I think that this movie is pure eye candy. And I think that when it's at its best, it's really moving and sincere about what its characters are going through, has a really positive message about, kind of dealing with, kind of similar to Luca, where it's like sort of like moving on from a certain chapter in your life, finding the strength to do that. It goes a little bit further in that department for sure. But I think the real spice of this movie is the music, probably. I think that it doesn't have Sufjan Stevens, but yeah, it does have just like really, really solid needle drops, doesn't overuse them. And it definitely has a club scene in here that I personally am obsessed with. So for that reason, I'm definitely a lighthearted fan of this one. I'm going to give it a B.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think at its best, this movie did kind of remind me of what I love about films from the filmmakers like Xavier Dolan or Pedro Almodovar, where it captures like that very vivid point in someone's lives where like there's this sort of like open-endedness in terms of like their youth, or like they refine some sense of their personality that just kind of comes alive thanks to another person. And I think at its best, that the movie really captures that feel and what I love about movies from those filmmakers. And I mean, I can't fully compare it to other Ozon films, but I do really appreciate how he presents like sensuality and like how characters can like feel so intertwined with one another while not fully knowing one another, and like that sort of like almost like voyeurism at times. I think he's really good at capturing that feeling in his film, especially in like the first half of this film. I think it's a good solid little film, and I'll give it a light but pretty warm B+.
All right, well, some solid recommendations from the two of us. I definitely think it's worth checking out myself, and it is now playing in North America. I think it's playing theatrically at the moment. It might be available in some virtual cinemas. I'm not sure, but I know it's going to be released in France next month, July 4th. Oh no, sorry, it was released in France last year. Misspoke there. It came out last July, so we're getting it a bit late, but better late than never.
Yeah,
and it is just 100 minutes long. Another 100-minute long film. That is the theme of this week, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it does it does feel appropriate to bookend Luca with this film, I feel like, in many ways.
Right, yeah. I kind of did that on purpose a little bit.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to our show. Be sure to subscribe to Cinemaholics on your favorite podcast app of choice, or find us on YouTube. See you all next time.